All right, so here we are for 15 minutes of gentle seated yoga practice. To find a seat, so you might be seated on a chair or a couch. It can be useful to have a little bit of a harder bottom underneath you, but that's not required. You can also sit on the floor if that feels accessible. So if you like, you might take a moment and you might notice your breath. And I noticed I was holding my breath as we're getting going. So one option might be to invite the breath back in if that's something that you notice. Yeah. So you might be inviting your breath in. You might notice the pacing of your breath, like are your inhales and exhales similar in length or are they different? Maybe just noticing. One option might be to, just let your breath be as it is. Another option might be to even out your inhales and exhales. So like maybe you're breathing in for a count of 4, however quickly or slow you want to count. And maybe you're exhaling out for a count of 4, perhaps counting at the same speed. So maybe inhaling for 4, and perhaps you're exhaling for 4, whatever that sounds like for you. You might be noticing movement in your body as you breathe, like you might notice movement in your chest or belly. You might not notice any movement at all as you breathe, and that's okay too. And maybe turning your head to one side. So you might be turning your head to one side, maybe turning it part of the way, or you could turn it as far as you can. You have a choice. And if your head is turned to the side, you might bring it back to center and maybe switching sides. So you could turn your head the other way. So you might be turning your head to one side, maybe turning it part of the way, or perhaps turning it as far as you can. You're in charge of how far to turn your head. Maybe noticing your breath. And perhaps turning your head back to center and maybe tilting your head to one side. So you might be tilting your head to one side, maybe so your ear moves in the direction of your shoulder. Maybe noticing your breath. And if your head is tilted to the side, you might bring it back to center and perhaps switching sides. So you might be tilting your head to one side, perhaps inviting in the breath. And if your head is tilted to one side, you might bring it back to center and maybe rolling your head, maybe making a full circle or two, or perhaps rolling it from side to side. This might be moving your head in a circle or a semicircle. And perhaps bringing your head back to center. And you're welcome to move your shoulders. So one way to do that might be to lift and lower your shoulders. Another option could be to roll your shoulders forward, or you could roll them back. So you have a choice. If you're moving your shoulders, you might bring them towards stillness and perhaps leaning back. So you might lean back so that you might be leaning back slightly. So perhaps you're leaning back without your top of your body touching the back of your chair. So you might be leaning back slightly. You might notice the breath. Maybe noticing some sensation in your abdominals, or maybe noticing something else. If you're leaning back, you might lift back up to center and perhaps reaching one arm up overhead. So you might lift one arm up to the sky. So maybe reaching your arm to the sky. And you might stay here. Another option could be to lean to the other side. So you might place your bottom arm on your chair or on your leg. You might be leaning to one side. Maybe noticing the breath. If you're leaning to one side, you might lift back up to center and perhaps lowering your arm if it was lifted. And you're welcome to switch sides. So you could reach your other arm up to the sky and maybe staying here, or you might lean to one side. So you might have your arm reaching to the sky, or you might be reaching to the opposite side. And you're welcome to notice the breath. Maybe noticing sensation in your shoulders or your back, or maybe the sides of your body. And if you're leaning to the side, you might lift back up to center and perhaps lowering your arm. And maybe extending your leg out in front of you. So you might extend one leg out in front of you, maybe lifting your foot up off the floor. So you could lift your foot maybe an inch or two off the floor. You could lift it higher if you'd like. You have a choice. Maybe noticing some sensation in the top of your leg. You might be noticing it somewhere else. Maybe not at all. If you haven't lowered your leg already, you might lower your leg to the floor or your foot to the floor, and maybe placing your foot back closer to your chair, and perhaps doing the other side. So you might extend one leg out in front of you, perhaps lifting your foot up off the floor, maybe lifting your foot up an inch or two, or you could lift it higher. You have a choice. Maybe noticing the breath. And if your leg is lifted, you might lower your foot back to the floor. And perhaps turning to your right. So you might turn to the right. So you might be lengthening your spine to the sky and maybe turning to the right. Perhaps placing your left hand on your right leg. Maybe noticing the breath. And if you're turning to the right, you might return back to center and perhaps switching sides. So you might turn the other way. So you might be turning to the left if you turn to the right the first time. So you might be turning to one side. And if you're turning to one side, you might notice some sensation across your back or the front of your torso and your belly area. You might notice it somewhere else. You might not notice any sensation at all. And if you're turned to the side, you might return back to center and perhaps crossing one leg over the other. So you might cross one ankle over your other thigh, maybe opening your knee to the side. You could flex your foot, so you might be moving your toes towards your shin. That's an option. And one option might be to lengthen your spine to the sky. Another option could be to hinge at your hips, maybe floating forward. So you have a choice. Maybe noticing your breath. I just noticed I was holding my breath. So if you notice that, you might choose to welcome your breath back in. And perhaps releasing. You're welcome to try the other side. So you might cross one leg over the other. perhaps crossing your ankle over your thigh. You might open your knee to the side. So you might have one leg crossed over the other with your knee to the side, maybe flexing your foot. So you might have your toes of your top foot moving towards your shin. Maybe noticing your breath. And one option might be to keep your spine lifted towards the sky. Another option might be to hinge at your hips, so maybe you're folding forward over your legs. You have a choice. And if you're folded forward, you might lift back up, and perhaps if your leg is crossed, you might release it. And maybe extending one leg out in front of you so that perhaps your heel is on the floor and maybe your leg is moving towards straight. So you might have more of a straight type leg with your foot on the floor in front of you, and you could lengthen your spine to the sky. Another option might be to hinge at your hips and fold forward, maybe placing your hands on your legs or the floor. You have a choice. Maybe noticing the breath. And if you're folded forward, you might lift back up and perhaps switching sides. So you might extend one leg out in front of you, perhaps placing your heel of that leg on the floor, maybe having your leg be straight or straightish. So you might have your leg extended and perhaps lengthening your spine to the sky. You might stay here. Another option might be to hinge at your hips and fold forward. So maybe you're placing your hands on your legs or on the floor. You have a choice. And you're welcome to notice the breath. Maybe noticing sensation in the back of your extended leg. You might notice it somewhere else. You may not notice any sensation at all. And if you're folded forward, you might lift back up. And perhaps as you inhale, you might reach your arms out to the sides and up overhead. And maybe as you exhale, you might move your hands through heart center down by your sides. Maybe as you inhale, you might reach your arms up overhead. And perhaps as you exhale, you might reach your arms down by your sides. And you're welcome to do that again. Maybe inhaling, you might reach your arms overhead. Maybe as you exhale, you might reach your arms down. And perhaps placing your hands on your legs. As you inhale, you might move your belly forward, maybe lifting your chest and your chin. Maybe as you exhale, you might round your spine, perhaps lowering your chin to your chest. So maybe as you're inhaling, you might move your belly forward, perhaps lifting your chest and your chin. And maybe as you're exhaling, you might round your spine, perhaps lowering your chin to your chest. And you're welcome to do that a couple more times, perhaps following your own breath. And perhaps returning back to center. So you might be seated, perhaps lengthening your spine to the sky, maybe noticing the breath. So you might take a moment to notice the breath. Maybe noticing movement in your belly or chest as you breathe. You might have your eyes opened, or you might choose to close your eyes. And you're welcome to stay seated upright, or another option could be to lean back in your chair. Or if you're on the floor, you could lie down on the floor. And I'll quiet my voice as we rest for about 10 more seconds. You're welcome to stay resting where you are longer. If you'd like, you might return to seated if you're not already there. Thank you for letting me guide your practice today. Peace. And you're welcome to stay resting where you are longer. I'd like to invite you to join me next Tuesday at noon, either live on YouTube, which you can find if you're on Clubhouse right now. You can find that through my link tree on Instagram. Alternatively, you can always just join me on Clubhouse if that's where you are. But I would like to invite you to also invite your friends to join us as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jen. As always, awesome.
Thanks, Lisa. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Welcome, Tiffany. I